let's get right down to it then. We're going to go over emitters today in a very, very basic way. What you need to know about emitters is that they're essentially an illuminative material. Okay? Yes, I am. Thank you. So when you consider it to be an illuminative material, that means that you're going to modify your illumination elements via the materials menu. Okay? So, and it also gets applied to elements in your model as a material. So that also means that you have to create secondary geometry in order to manage some of those. I'll just say some of those lighting elements, right? So I put myself in this position right here so that we can look at basically the lighting in a more simplistic and controlled way at first, right? So I'm just going to put some downlights here on this porch, and then we'll get into the interior condition in our actual building. Okay, so let me jump back into the top view and then look at sort of where I am, right? So if I go in here and I say camera, show, well, my camera's sitting a little bit outside of the porch, but basically this is the porch right here. I'm going to actually just create lights that are going to be placed on the ceiling of this space, and then they're just going to shine down, essentially. Right now, I'm just going to work with a single surface. I'm not going to build like an actual lighting housing that holds the light, but eventually you're going to want to get to that level of detail. So to get started real fast, I'm just going to very, very quickly go into the top view and just make some squares. So I just make that square. I'll just make it a planar surface like that. Or you could do a 4-point surface. However you want to make it, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to essentially just pull that into the plane of view, or the picture plane, essentially. So let's see, where am I? Oh, I'm a little high. So let me pull that down. There we go. And just make sure that it is visible, right? So now it's in our frame, and it is visible. But what you need to be aware of here is that your surfaces have direction. The surfaces having direction defines which way the light shines, basically. And the backside of an emissive material surface is just going to be black. You need to know that. So without getting into much detail, I'm very quickly just going to check which way this thing is facing, and then I'm going to go through the process of dropping an emissive material onto it. In order to check which way it's facing, you have this cool tool that's down here on the left. It's called Analyze Direction. When you click that, you'll have these arrows that show up. And basically, those arrows are showing you which direction the surface is facing. For those of you who know a little bit about the inner workings of the geometry, that's your z-axis or your surface z-axis, or otherwise known as your surface normal. So in this case, ours are going up. We need to flip it to go down. You can just click on flip right here, and it'll shoot the direction of that line downward. Flip is when you click it, just hit flip and then enter, and it should stay down. There you go. Yeah, flip and then enter. Okay, so the next step really is I just want to get an emissive material on this thing so that I can test it and play around with some of the settings, okay? So in your materials menu, I want you to right click, and instead of going to like the MXM gallery, we're actually going to create a new emitter. We're going to do this manually, and there's a good reason for that, and I'll kind of show you why in a moment. So your new emitter comes in just like anything else, but it shows up like this bright white sphere because it's a light, right? It's just shining light. There are quite a few settings that you need to be aware of at first to even really get it to work, kind of. So you should know that when you're creating custom materials, they have sort of layers of settings. These layers will, in many cases, interact with one another, but generally speaking, the most generalized settings of a material are up here at the actual element type, right? So that would be, this is an emitter, and so these are all of your general emitter settings. When you go into layer, this part isn't really all that specific. It's just kind of like any other layer property. You can change opacity and kind of rename it something else. But the real meat of it right here is under the emitter setting. So you've got the material emitter name, and then you've got the actual emitter setting. Let's see. No, we want to stay on color, omni, custom. Yeah, we'll stick with this. Okay, so under here, we're going to stick with color for now. Temperature and HDR image are going to just kind of confuse you. But you can change the color of the light, like basically make it any kind of like RGB value, and the light will shine that color. Or when you uncheck that, you can actually just change the color temperature. So that color temperature that you were sliding back and forth for the overall image quality, well, you can do that per light, and that's what happens here. So if you want it to be just white light, leave it in the middle. If you want it to be sort of like a cool blue, move it a little bit more to the right. That's going to be kind of closer to like halogen lights and stuff like that. And then if you want it to be more of like an incandescent, then you move it further over to the left. And then you can have, you know, like, I don't know, nuclear hazard, biohazard lights and stuff like that, if you want to go all the way red. But we're going to generally stick with white because all of our surfaces are going to be composed of whites and grays to start off. Okay. So additionally, you should understand the idea of luminance. And at some point, we might go through and explore these in greater detail. But generally speaking, a lot of rendering engines will try to emulate physical properties of light using watts and efficacy. So the watts is essentially how much power is being fed into the light, and then the efficacy is how much of that power is actually being emitted by the light. So the watts here, I will say this, Maxwell for Rhino, Maxwell in general, kind of prides itself on being physically accurate with lighting and environment, but I have yet to find a good resource to teach how to get it calibrated properly. So generally speaking, what a lot of new users do is they just kind of amplify it up to like an excessive level, like 4,000, 5,000 watts. So let's jump it up to 5,000 watts, and you'll kind of see what I mean when we get into it. Additionally, I tend to bump up the efficacy a little bit too, so I'll start at like 100. And then eventually we'll figure out, as a team here, we'll figure out how we're going to calibrate that down into the actual model scale. But you should be able to use like 40 watt, 100 watts and stuff like that. What I do know about most rendering engines so far is that the less light you have, the more you have to amplify it in order to get some light in your space. Okay, and the sun position and sun lighting it's basically a balancing game. But anyway, so since we only have one light, we're gonna beef this thing up and really show it pretty well. So the other thing that I wanted to show you here, if you go back up to the emitter general settings, there's this really cool preview feature. Like right now, this doesn't tell you that much, right? I mean, it's a white sphere, but I don't know what it actually looks like in space. I can switch it. If you go all the way down here to preview and scene sampling level, you can switch the way that it previews to actually show as if it's sort of in a room. And this one is a popular one that a lot of users use. Emitter 10 meter or a 2 meter 10 meter is generally pretty good because you can use it for big spaces and stuff like that. So then when you go over here to the refresh preview, it's going to change that preview to show you a source and then how the light actually spreads throughout the space. So that's extremely powerful because if this space is 10 meters wide, then you're going to have a lot of burn around the actual lighting element, and then it's not generally going to project with defined shadow on the other side of the space. Does that make any sense to you all? So we can switch it then back to 2 meter, and you can see that it's, that's your 2 meter projection. So anything within 2 meters is going to burn about that much. Let's see. We'll leave it there. The other settings I don't think we're going to worry about until they become necessary. We're just doing general lighting for now. So you can just X out of that, and you'll see that your preview here has already been modified. It's ready to go. All you have to do is just put it on the layer that is going to define the lighting elements, and so we need to put it on that layer. So let's go to new layer, and we'll just call this one Light A, or you can call it Light 5000 or something like that. Whatever you want to use as your naming convention, I'm fine with that. And then just pull that emitter onto that layer. And last but not least, select the surface that we created, and then change it to that object layer. And to make it a little bit easier on myself, I'm going to change it to a gold layer color. All right. There is one more thing that you need to change in order to really get this thing kind of functioning properly for more of a studio kind of setting, right? Sort of draft renders. You basically need to, and let me find where that setting was again. Oh yeah, multi-light. There you go. So Maxwell has this function called multi-light, and it's basically another way of rendering your lighting engine. Okay, so when you turn that on to either intensity or color, the focal point is either going to be the intensity or quality of the light and how it bounces around the space, or the focal point is going to be the color of the light. Okay, so when we go into intensity, we'll have the option of playing around with those settings on the post-production side rather cleanly. The other thing I think that maybe you might want to consider at this point is that when you do lights, it really drastically increases the render time. So I'm fairly certain that in this case, what we're going to want to do is bump up our time limit to something like 10 or 15 minutes. Let's start at 10 for now, and then we'll move into a modeling sort of assignment / exercise for the next 10 minutes as it renders. And then we'll go into modify that a little bit later on. Okay, so I just ran through quite a few things. I showed you how to create an emissive material, and then how to change the settings of that to change the luminance of that particular lighting family. So are there any questions that you have right now before we hit render? No questions. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and hit render now, or take a couple minutes to basically get a light or two in there. I think I'm going to create 2 of these lights, and then hit render, and we'll get together again after the drafts are done, and we'll take a look at the result. Oops, looks like mine didn't work. All right, so I'm just going to close. This is still kind of tacked on to the last video. I'm just going to close this thought real fast by just showing you the final image. And I'll probably save it on the drive for you to access it so you can see it a little bit more high res. But what you're going to see here is that you actually have some illumination where otherwise there would be none. So we're still trying to work on balancing the environment lighting versus the need for exterior lighting, which theoretically in a physical environment you wouldn't really need lighting out here. But you know, we'll work through that as we progress too. The other thing that I wanted to show you real quick is kind of what I've been working with when it comes to the lighting and the materiality. Right now these surfaces are kind of a matte default sort of plastic material. And so what I started playing around with was a couple of drafts about using the matte plastic white with color temperature of the lights, and then transitioning that to be our glossy white glass. So this right here is the white light, and so you can see that it kind of creates and it's still pretty dark, but it does kind of create a good sense of space here, and you can kind of see where the surface starts to move away from another surface. The shadow becomes a little bit more diffuse, but you can also see a little bit of reflection on the surface. When I switched it over to a warmer light, the shadows became a little bit more intense. The reflections became a little bit less intense. And this is an extreme example. It's almost like the whole scene is orange, so it's not that great. But the one with full glossy, which I rendered for a little bit longer too, you can see that the shadows kind of fall off a little bit down the bottom right here. So you'll need to balance when and where that is going to be useful. In a general sense, I think what we're probably going to strive for is using the semi-reflective, more plastic white on interior shots, and the highly reflective white glass material on exterior shots as a general principle so far. Okay, because we're going to want more reflection on an exterior shot. So on that subject, are there any questions? Okay, let me stop this video then, and we'll close by, I'll review some of your stuff too.